The Education of OverSoul7 by Jane Roberts, read by Martin John, Chapter 24, Discussions Between Lives in which Lydia doesn't believe she's dead, but Cromwell knows. Lydia and Lawrence drove along. Contentedly, Lydia polished her sunglasses, put them back on, and lit a cigarette. "You've got to believe me," Lawrence said desperately. "I tried to tell you on the picnic. We're both dead. This whole thing, the road, landscape, the trailer, it's all a hallucination. In, well, greater terms, it doesn't exist. It just isn't real." Lydia petted Greenacre. "And Greenacre? He's dead too, I suppose?" She delighted in baiting him. "No, Greenacre, the real cat, isn't dead. Or I don't know. He may have died. I just don't know enough to state the mortal status of that particular cat." "Well, I'm glad to hear you admit that. What is this, anyhow? A new philosophy that you've picked up somewhere?" "It certainly took, I'll say that. I've never heard of anything so—" "Lydia, you've got to believe me," Lawrence said. "If the trailer's a hallucination, how come you aren't taking your eyes off the road?" "Habit. Just habit," he said. "All right. For sake of argument, I'll go along. But if it isn't real, and you know it, then you wouldn't believe in it and it would all go away. Isn't that how hallucinations work?" "I don't believe in it." "Hush. Don't you yell at me, Larry. I've never heard you argue like this or raise your voice before in your life, much less over an esoteric point of philosophy." "But you believe it," he cried. "And as long as you do, it'll all keep happening. Besides, that old man, OverSoul7, is maintaining it for you, too." "Why, how nice of him." Lawrence shut his mouth and went on driving. After a while he said, "You know how young you've grown? Look in the mirror. You look 30. That should convince you, if nothing else." "There. That's something else. What makes you think I'd be alive and getting younger if I were dead?" "If I were dead, I'd be a corpse, and I wouldn't be getting anything. I wouldn't dream either, if that's what you're going to say next." "No, you aren't dreaming." "Of course I'm not," he groaned. "I just don't understand what's happening at all," Lydia said. "I admit it. And how come you still look near 60, so you'd recognize me?" "Honestly, Larry, that's plain silly. You aren't sick, are you?" "If not, I don't know why not. Lydia, I'm not sick. I'm dead. I've never met anyone so stubborn in my life." "Honestly, I'm getting fed up, Lawrence. I just don't understand you at all. If we're dead, prove it." "All right, I will," he said. He thought about being young, tried hard to remember what he looked like. Beside him, Lydia shouted with astonishment, "You did it! Just like I did! You look fantastic! Oh, Larry, what on earth have we hit upon? If scientists find out, we'll be famous." Lydia's tone caught him off guard. Then he realized that her consciousness wasn't quite together yet. She wasn't functioning with her complete reasoning faculties. He suspected she wasn't because she was afraid that she'd discover the truth, and the truth was against her belief in the nature of reality. This was all quite new to Lawrence, too. He tried to figure it out. "What will we have for lunch?" she said. "Anything we want will be in the refrigerator, I suppose," he said dryly. "Well, if that's how hallucinations work, then I'm all for 'em," Lydia said. "Oh, Larry, I don't mean to hurt your feelings, but driving along with a man who's convinced he's dead is something new. You've had some weird ideas in the past, but we're alive, but dead. Well, that's a much nicer concept, I'll say that." She paused and stroked the cat. "Greenacre, you certainly purr loud enough for any two cats, dead or alive." Lawrence said, "Do you know what it's like, driving through a hallucinatory landscape, trying to convince your mistress that she's dead? Larry, you have to admit that sounds pretty wild. It would make a great short story, though. You are joking, aren't you? Lydia, what do you think would happen if you, well, went back to that old folks' home?" "Tell the truth," Lawrence said. "That was a dreadful nightmare. What an awful thing to suggest." But Lawrence remembered how things worked, or seemed to work. If thinking about being young made you young, then thinking about... He concentrated on Lydia as the old woman in the home, and what it must have meant to her. He tried to think about what it must have been like. They were walking down the corridor. "Lawrence!" Lydia grabbed his hand. "What's happening?" He looked around them. Well, at least he'd gotten rid of the trailer. Maybe memories from the old people's home would snap Lydia out of it and make her face the truth, he thought. He said, "This is the home you were in as an old woman. Don't be frightened. It's all over now." "I'm not frightened. I'm mad. What's happened to the trailer?" she broke off. "Why, I know those nurses. That's Miss Only talking to sweet young thing." "See, it'll all come back to you," he said. "Well, suppose I don't want it to," Lydia said defiantly. "I'm young now, and I'm going to stay young." "You can. You are." "Don't take that tone with me, Larry, and in public. What are you up to?" She paused. "Oh, I just remembered something else. An old man. His name is Cromwell. I think I'll just look in on him. Don't go so fast. Should I speak to the nurses, I wonder? They'll never recognize me, of course, I'm so young." Lawrence just shook his head. It was useless, he thought, to say anything. The two women stood there talking, taking no notice as Lydia and Lawrence passed by. "Why, they didn't even nod," Lydia said. "You'd think they didn't see us at all." "They didn't," Lawrence said. "Darling, we're ghosts." Lydia stared at him. His age had stabilized so that he looked about 28. She felt so exuberant herself and for him, and here he was talking all that nonsense. She said, "Here I am, trying to figure out what's happening, and all you do is spout this idiocy about our being dead. Now either stop it or don't come with me. You'll just upset Cromwell. When I saw him last, he was confused enough." "I'll be quiet," Lawrence said. "Well, that's better." Lydia grinned and went waltzing into the common room. She gasped. Toothless Cromwell looked simply awful. "Oh, Larry," she said involuntarily. Lawrence said nothing. He just tightened his grip on her arm. Patients sat in wheelchairs all around the walls of the room. Some, like Cromwell, were tied into their chairs. Cromwell's face was sunken. He'd kicked off his shoes and socks, and he no longer had any teeth at all. The TV was on, a ball game, poorly focused. The announcer called the plays of the game. An old woman snored loudly. She was sitting up quite neatly in her wheelchair and held a melting chocolate cookie. "That old woman looks vaguely familiar," Lydia said. "I've had this dream before." "Have you?" Lawrence almost smiled. He might be able to convince her of the truth now. She might believe it, if only to get out of this place. "What's that noise?" Lydia asked. "You can't hear yourself think." He listened. Drums, singing, a terrible band. "Oh," she said, "the Mission Society Sunday services. I never went to that, thank you, mad or no." "When didn't you go?" Lawrence asked. "Well, on Sundays when they had it." "That's not what I meant, and you know it." "Oh, hush! Who knows what you mean?" Lydia stopped. A young man sat on the window-sill reading. He had red hair and wore a green fedora, which was silly but nice, she thought. She poked Lawrence. "I wonder who he is. He doesn't act like a visitor, and he certainly can't be an attendant." At the same time, a young woman appeared. She looked agitated, almost angry, and before Lawrence or Lydia could say or do anything, she strode to the door and out into the hall. They followed her. The off-key band was louder now, its music obviously coming from an open room at the end of the hall. The young woman stood in the doorway, looking in, almost insolently. Then she cried angrily, "Lousy racket! For God's sakes, can't you just quit and go home? These poor old people, you'd drive them mad if they weren't already." The music went on. "Idiots!" the woman shouted, coming back. "Isn't that the end?" she said to Lydia. "Who are you, anyhow? You don't belong here." "I'm Lydia." "Lydia? What on earth are you doing back here?" "Well, I don't know, really. I don't recall meeting you before." "Didn't Tweety reach you?" "Tweety?" The young woman turned to Lawrence. "Listen, she isn't supposed to be here, and I don't know what you're doing here either." "It's a bit difficult to explain," Lawrence said. "Cromwell," the woman shouted. "You better come over here." Lydia turned toward Cromwell's body, which just sat there. The young man looked up from his book. "What's the matter?" "I'm reading." He came over, tipping his green fedora when he saw Lydia. "This is your old friend, Lydia. Believe it or not," the woman said. "At least, I think it is. And she doesn't have the slightest idea what's going on. Figure that one out." Cromwell smiled with brilliant recognition. "Of course! I was so busy I didn't pay any attention. I just knew some people had come in, our kind, I mean." He looked at Lydia. "But you turned into your younger self once when you were out of body with me. I'm sorry I didn't recognize you." "But Lydia began. He interrupted her, smiling. "Fantastic to see you again. Is this gentleman a friend of yours? We're the only ones left, the old crew." "The old crew?" Lydia asked. "She doesn't know," Lawrence said significantly. "She won't believe me." "Oh, she doesn't know," the young man grinned. "So you don't want to remember, huh?" he said to Lydia with a laugh. "Remember what?" Lydia said sharply. "Are you Cromwell's grandson or something? It's not very nice of you to carry on so, when he's in such terrible condition." "It certainly isn't," he said gleefully. "He can't even spit through his teeth any more." Lydia was shocked, and suddenly she felt very tired. "How long are you going to avoid facing it?" the young man said. "Watch." He grinned at her and walked over to the old man Cromwell's body and disappeared into it. Cromwell opened his eyes. That's all that was necessary. Lydia ran over to the window crying, and in her mind's eye she saw herself and Cromwell, two senile old people flying over the grounds, looking down at the strollers below and the benches, and it all came back. "What a nasty trick," she gasped, when she could talk. "I'd have to face it myself. It's just so unbelievable." "You're so hard-headed," Lawrence said. Cromwell, the young one, sauntered across the room. "At least you're safely dead," he said. "We're studying and learning, but we still have the death bit to go through. And all those idiots out there shouting about heaven and eternal bliss," the young woman said. "Incidentally, Lydia, do you remember me now?"
"I'm Mariah."
"Over there. The old lady with the cookie." "Oh," Lydia cried. "My body, then, where is it? It must be burned." "No, cremated," Lawrence said. "Mine too. We decided on that ahead of time." "Usually you have to wait till you're really fed up with your body," Mariah said. "I mean, it just gets so it doesn't work right. See my body over there? It still likes to eat. I mean, it still wants to, and up to a certain point, a body has its rights." "Mine fights back," Cromwell said. He stood there, looking very elegant and dapper, staring at it. "I tried to bow out twice, but it just mobilized itself and pulled through. So you have to give it credit, in a way. I'll just have to ride it out, and while it lasted, it was a great body." "But I just went all at once," Lawrence said. "I thought everyone did." "No, of course Lydia didn't even know when she died. I knew. I felt a twinge of regret, I suppose, when I left my body on the park bench, with Lydia's help. I know I didn't want to get old in it, or I didn't want to get old. But now I wonder, there was still a lot of vitality in it. I'd made up my mind, though, half without knowing. That must have made the difference." "Die and learn," Mariah said, grinning. "But seriously, Lydia, Tweety's been looking for you." Cromwell interrupted. "I tried to help you when you died, Lydia, but you wouldn't let me." "That's all right," Lydia said. "But who is Tweety?" "I don't know," Mariah said. "Maybe she has something to do with, well, the classes we attend. We pretty much understand what's going on around here, and we help the other people as they begin to operate independently of their bodies, like Cromwell tried to help you. Now we're pretty certain that the classes are hallucinatory in some way, but real in another way. The things we learn are certainly real enough. We think that perhaps the room, the teachers, and so forth are just images or projections for our benefit, so we'll understand. But the fact is, we're deciding if we want to be born again, and if so, under what circumstances," Cromwell said, "and we're learning that we can't intellectualize everything." "You certainly sound more educated than you did," Lydia said. "You used to say ain't all the time." "You were a bit of a snob, in your way," Cromwell said. Lydia sighed. "I suppose I was." "Well, you'd better find Tweety. She was around when you were here before. Once I tried to tell you," Mariah said. "I do recall a voice once." Lydia stopped, then said, "But Cromwell, if you want to die, why won't your body let you?" "Oh, it would if I really pushed it, but the cells are still alive, and parts of it work great. And to tell the truth, I think my body's relieved and at peace with me out of it, and not bugging it all the time. As long as I'm busy and happy, I suppose I shouldn't begrudge it that. And bodies change, too, Mariah said. Thank heavens. The cells and the awareness in them. Bodies want their own fulfillment. Strange, even with mine, eating those lousy chocolate cookies all the time. I felt it, yearning to return to the earth again, unorganized for a change, free to be anything. I mean, just scatter. And it's amazing, the vitality of bodies. The ones we have now are great, of course. They don't age. But they also make you appreciate your physical bodies even more, with all the stresses they go through. I think I'm going to cry, Lydia said. I don't even know where mine is. Lawrence grinned. Roger has the ashes in a mayonnaise jar. I don't know how he worked that. Larry, that's awful. Before I do anything else, I'm going to unplug that jar and let the ashes out. Scatter them someplace where they can be free. Oh, I never liked mayonnaise. Suddenly she broke off. Why, if I'm alive though I've died, then I must have a soul. I always thought that was just a big bunch of nonsense. Listen to that racket, Mariah cried. The Sunday services were winding up. Just as Lydia finished speaking and Mariah interrupted, the band broke into a resounding off-key rendition of Never, My God, to Thee. Lydia glowered and said, That's what I mean, that stuff. But in the meantime, just as Lydia said, I must have a soul, OverSoul7 appeared. Now Lydia turned and saw him. In his eyes she saw all of her memories from the day of her birth as Lydia. She knew who she was and who 7 was. She saw the love and the order that had always been beneath her days, and the hospital disappeared, and Lawrence, and Mariah, and Cromwell. End chapter 24. Peace, light, and love. Aloha.